California Dreamin'. It's a popular song for a reason, and for one family, living in the mountains above Coachella Valley was a dream come true. Their house was safe and secluded. The reception was spotty, and if you heard gunshots, it meant the neighbors were shooting targets. But one scary September night, as 3 people got ready for bed, they were the targets. The house collapsed in flames, and all their dreams burned with it, begging the question, are we safe in our own homes? And what evil lurks in the wilderness? Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 20 of the Darklivity podcast. I'm your host, Kimbyr, and I'm here with my co-host, my best friend, my partner in crime, Jonathan.
Hi.
I can't believe.
I can't believe.
I can't believe it.
We made it to 20.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. We finished each other's sandwiches. If you're new here, welcome. You may be leaving right now after hearing us say that.
Darklivity. It's the dark downward slope into the degradation of the human mind and the consequences that such darkness brings to light.
And before we begin, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out just in case we decide to post on a different day. We've been trying our best to stay on schedule. So thank you so much for your patience as I am coming to the end of my pregnancy. I'm proud to say that we have a sponsor for today's video. It's a brand that I heard about again and again and finally tried a couple years ago, and that's Ritual. And number one, how cool do these vitamins look? That's the first thing that drew me in when I tried the multivitamin. But of course, there are many more important reasons that I chose Ritual for my prenatal. When you're trying to get pregnant, or you already are, you're truly trying to do whatever you can to make the best choices for your baby. Don't make this prenatal mistake when it comes to nutrient needs during pregnancy. It's important that the products you're taking are clean and safe for your baby, and that's why I love and chose Ritual. It's also the first prenatal made traceable, so you know what you're putting in your body because not all ingredients are created equal.
They're also vegan friendly, non-GMO, gluten and allergen free, with no shady fillers, colorants, or additives.
And remember the first thing you noticed when I showed them to you?
Oh yeah, they smell really good, and I love the way that they look inside the pill.
If you know, you know. It is a game changer, trust me. As a person that hates taking pills, especially stinky ones, as soon as I opened my first bottle of the prenatal at the beginning of my pregnancy journey, I was like, wow. I started with the citrus essence ones, and now I just got the mint ones, and you have to smell these.
They smell like mint.
They're so good. They're also gentle on my stomach, which is very important with everything else you have going on when you're pregnant.
They are delayed release capsules designed to be easy on the stomach and can be taken with or without food.
Exactly. And they are designed to bypass the stomach and dissolve in the small intestine, which is the ideal place for nutrient absorption. And the nested capsule doesn't just look cool, it actually serves a purpose. It combines dry and oily ingredients in one so that you can take your omega-3 with your vitamin D.
And also Ritual is a subscription, which is good. You won't forget to reorder.
Because I forget a lot of things, especially with pregnancy brain. And I definitely don't want to have to think about reordering them. And they're automatically delivered right to my door every month, so I never run out. Plus, you can get 25% off your first order if you use the link in our description box and the code Darklivity. And if you don't like Ritual, within the first 30 days, your first order is on them.
Thanks, Ritual, for supporting our channel and making today's video possible.
Now let's get into the case for today. And I would like to introduce you to the first person we'll be talking about, John M. Hayward. John was born on December 13th of 1950 in Santa Fe, the capital of New Mexico. And when John was little, he, his parents, and his 2 sisters packed up and moved to Southern California, where John spent the rest of his life. Y'all share the same name, and you both came right here from Southern California.
That's right.
The John in our story went to California State University, Fullerton for college, where he majored in geography and urban planning. After getting his degree, he became an independent contractor, which meant he could build anything he wanted whenever he wanted. And John loved to get outside and work with his hands. You could tell what profession he was in from the calluses and his deep tan. John married his first wife when he was 25, and they had 3 children. And then they moved to Coachella Valley in 1981. And even if you're not from California, you've probably heard of Coachella Valley or the Palm Springs area, which is one of my favorite places in California. That is where the Coachella Music Festival is held every year, and I've never cared to go to that, but I do love Palm Springs. But I'm sure you have seen influencers dress up and do their best to survive the summer heat while getting to see some of their favorite artists in the valley. And it is hot. Riverside County is in the Colorado desert. It's not in Colorado, though. It's 7 million acres in California, including cities like Palm Springs, Thousand Palms, Cathedral City, Palm Desert, Bermuda Dunes, Indio, La Quinta, and Coachella. It's bordered to the north by the San Bernardino Mountains and the south by the Santa Rosa and San Jacinto Mountains. That's where the rural alpine communities like Pinyon Pines comes into play. It's named after pinyon pine trees that are native to the area. Anyone who wants to live in a cooler climate just needs to drive up Highway 74 through the winding hills to get to absolute paradise.
Now, John Hayward spent most of his life working in the valley, and in his free time, restoring old tractors, hiking, fishing, and spending time with his kids. He loved being a dad. He was divorced, and when his kids moved out of the house, John went back to dating. In the early 2000s, he met a woman named Vicky Friedley, and they bonded over their love of nature. Vicky liked John because he was a hippie, and John liked Vicky because she was sweet.
Yeah, and he actually called her his cupcake because she was so sweet.
Vicky lived in a hand-built home out in Pinyon Pines. She was on her way to being an empty nester, so John moved in with her. John felt safe in Pinyon Pines. Compared to Palm Springs, where the crime rate is 1.5 times higher than the national average, Pinyon Pines was secluded and nobody bothered him. John felt free and at peace.
So let me tell you a little bit more about Vicky Friedley. She was born Vicky Lee DeBiver on February 5th of 1953 in Englewood, California, which is part of Los Angeles, and Vicky attended San Marcos High School with her two sisters and graduated in 1971. After that, she studied to become a nurse. Vicky was married just out of college, and 3 years later, she gave birth to a baby girl named Tiffany Teasdale. Unfortunately, her first marriage wasn't meant to be, and Vicky was single for a few years until she met a man named Ronald Friedley, a soft-spoken cop, and she fell for him fast. He got along with her daughter Tiffany, and he was good with his hands. He loved to build things, which Vicky really liked, and on May 13th of 1980, they got married. The couple went on to have 3 daughters of their own. The first 2 were Tanya and Jessica. Jessica actually went by the name Drew, which was her middle name.
Then Ron got a job working for the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, so they moved to Coachella Valley. But frankly, Ron wasn't a fan of the hot weather. He bought a parcel of land in the Pinyon Pines, part of the San Jacinto Mountains, where the weather was nicer. Ron and his dad built a white 2-story farmhouse with dark green trim at 68550 Alpine Road, along with a treehouse for the kids. They moved into the house in 1985.
To me, this looks like the middle of absolutely nowhere. But I know that some people really enjoy secluded areas. It kind of reminds me of when we went to Joshua Tree, except less houses, but they did have a couple neighbors at the time.
I kind of like that environment.
Yeah, but until you live there.
Right. Vicky and Ron's daughters were all 2 years apart, meaning Tanya was 4 and Drew was 2 when Vicky gave birth to their next addition, Rebecca. Ron was a girl dad. He was sweet, but devoted to teaching his daughters to defend themselves. Drew and Tanya described their childhood as a storybook upbringing in Pinyon Pines, while Ron describes the area as nice and country. He liked that it was out of the city, and he thought it would be a great place to raise a family. They loved to go for walks in the forest and spent lots of time outdoors.
Vicky was free-spirited, energetic, and a glass-half-full sort of person. She got a job working in the women's shoe department at Macy's in Palm Desert, but her true passion was taking care of others. She gardened, she quilted, she helped her daughters out with their homework. She did work on her computer, and she loved cooking. She loved cooking so much, her mission was to teach all of her family recipes to her daughters. She was always fashionable, too. She loved dyeing her hair different colors, red and blonde, and wearing fun earrings and necklaces. After a decade together, Ron actually came to Vicky with some bad news. He said he cared about her a lot, but he'd fallen out of love and he wanted a divorce. That's devastating. And Vicky truly loved him. She didn't want him to go, and they tried to make it work. But after 3 years of discussion, Ron finalized the divorce. He left the house and got a place of his own in Hemet, agreeing to pay child support as the kids finished middle and high school. Vicky had her daughters on the weekdays, and Ron took them on the weekends. He continued to work for the sheriff's department until Becky turned 18. Vicky continued to work at Macy's to make ends meet, and she also chose to keep Ron's last name. So that is how she became Vicky Friedley.
So Ron started dating, and so did Vicky. And Vicky met Jon, who we told you about in the beginning. She thought he was the perfect match for her. It didn't matter if money was tight, they were happy together. The kids, Tiffany, Tanya, Drew, and Becky went off to do their own things, but in 2005, Becky decided to move back to Pinyon Pines to start college. And this is a great time to introduce you to Becky.
Becky was born Rebecca Anna Lee Friedley on October 26th of 1987 in Palm Springs. She eventually went by the nickname Becky, and I wondered where she and Tanya got their unique and so beautiful green eyes, because green eyes are the rarest color, and wow, their eyes are so pretty. I know that Ron had blue eyes and Vicky had brown, so I'm kind of blown away by this beautiful green eye color. But personality-wise, Becky did take after Vicky. She was energetic, smiley, fearless, but actually that wasn't quite true. She did have a phobia. She had a fear of fire. And I can actually understand that because fire is very mysterious, but it's also very scary. And Becky had a reason to be scared. When she was young, Vicky was in the kitchen making tacos on the stove when Becky pulled the pan of grease off of the stove, and all that grease flew on her, and she got third-degree burns on her chest, which caused a lot of scarring there. And I have to ask all of you, what is your biggest fear? I think if I got in an accident like that, it would totally change the way I see things in life. And when I was 12, I was watching my friends fish over a bridge, and my friend got snagged on something on the bottom, and he kept like pulling his rod harder and harder. And the next thing I knew, I had been unconscious, didn't know that part. I woke up to being in an ambulance with blood going from like my head all the way down to my waist. I had no idea what happened. And he actually kept, pulling it back to the point where the hook came undone, but the weight hit me in the head. So it hit me like right near my temple and between my eyes. And of course, when the ambulance took me in and everything, they said that it could have been blind or it could have died. So I kind of always think about that when I'm like going over a bridge. Even today, I'll like look and be like, oh, remember that time? So these freak accidents do happen. Tell me about one of yours. Do you have any freak accidents?
I don't have any freak accidents, but I have an irrational fear of being buried alive in a box.
Oh, why?
Sounds terrifying.
It is terrifying. But despite what Becky went through as a child, she was full of life. She was the life of the party. She was a class clown. She would wear ridiculous hats and she would pull off crazy stunts. She loved to dance and she committed herself to making people laugh. But she also had a serious side. She was a hardworking student. In elementary school, she was so ahead that she would help her older sisters finish their homework assignments. Becky was a helper and a fixer. She hated when things went unresolved. Becky was also a gorgeous girl with long blonde hair and striking green eyes, and she had a lot of friends. Her best friend was Jeannie McDaniels. She was also extremely close with her cousin, Daniela Zimeno, and she was doted on by both her mother and her father.
Becky went to grammar school from kindergarten to 8th grade, and that's where she met her friends Javier Garcia Jr. and Robert Pape. In 2002 and 2003, Becky went to Palm Desert High School, while the two guys attended Cathedral City High. Becky did theater and volleyball, and she and Robert got into a relationship in 2004. That year, she transferred to Hart High School in Newhall, California, a 3-hour drive away. That's where Becky's older sister Tiffany was living with her son, Nathan Brito. Becky loved being an aunt, and being close to Nathan was perfect, but she drove back to Pinyon Pines often to hang out with Robert, Javier, Vicky, and Jon.
Robert and Becky went to prom together as a couple in 2005. And in videos, she looks stunning. She's wearing a halter top dress that starts out a coral pink color and ends in a sunny yellow satin skirt. Her hair is curled, and she and Robert have a silly, joking relationship. He's wearing a black shirt, gray suit as they walk around the front of her house. And one of Becky's sisters is filming, and she says that they look like they're getting married. They look like a very happy couple. Becky was serious about Robert. He was her first love. He came to her graduation in May while Becky walked in her red cap and gown, and he was there when she moved back to Vicky's house in the fall of 2005. Becky then enrolled in College of the Desert, where she studied nursing. She was also working full-time night shifts, but they were more like graveyard shifts at Denny's to pay herself through school. This woman was very hardworking, and since it was a 40-minute drive from her school back to her mom's house in Pinyon Pines, she would usually spend the night on her friends' couches out in the valley.
Becky was close with her cousin Daniela Zermeño, the daughter of one of Vicky's sisters. She spent at least 3 days a week with Javier Garcia, getting food and watching movies. At that time, her newest friend was Jeannie McDaniel, who she had met in class. Becky was doing really well, but her relationship was not. After 15 months, Becky and Robert called it quits in 2006. Robert graduated high school and started dating a friend of his named Sarah. Becky went on to finish her first year of college and ended up moving on and dating Javier's cousin, Jacob Santiago. She also spent her summer visiting family around California. And to catch you up on the family, Becky's sister Tanya was now a deputy sheriff in El Dorado County, and her sister Drew was in Japan. She was a nurse in the Air Force.
Nursing and also law enforcement seemed to run in the family.
Yeah, but by this time, Ron was retired. He had moved to Shasta County, a 12-hour drive away, with his new wife.
And Tiffany was living with Vicky's friend in Santa Clarita. She was taking care of her son, going to school, and Nathan had a summer birthday, so Becky drove up and they celebrated together. As she was leaving, Tiffany thanked her for coming all that way for Nathan's special day. She said who knows when they would see each other again, but Becky laughed. She was like, duh, of course I'm going to see you guys again. But actually, she never would. And those are the moments that scare me so much because we hear about them in cases like this.
In the evening of Sunday, September 17th, 2006, it was an average night in Pinyon Pines. Jon and Vicky were turning in for bed, and Becky was getting ready for a late-night hike before her Denny's shift at 11 p.m. The Riverside County Sheriff's Office was busy. Before 8:30 p.m., they had 3 separate calls out in Pinyon Pines. There was a party going on with meth involved, someone threatened to kill their neighbor, and someone else threatened to burn down the mountain.
Wow, I guess even being a secluded area, there's never a dull moment anywhere.
Right. Well, by 9:45, everything was quiet. The sun went down, and Timothy Summerly, a sheriff's deputy who lived catty-corner from the Friedleys, got in bed with his wife and turned off the lights. That's when he saw something outside his window, a flickering fire.
At first, he couldn't believe his eyes, and then the fire grew, and that's when he realized it was the Friedleys' house, and the fire was coming out of the windows. It was dry season, so Tim knew if the pines caught fire, then the entire community could go up in smoke. He called 911. He and his wife got in their car and they drove up to the Friedleys' driveway, where 5 cars were parked outside the garage. The fire had grown to the point where Tim could hear sporadic pops like gunshots from John's ammunition exploding inside of the home. Jim, another neighbor, showed up and he told Tim that a propane tank might have burst. So Jim and Tim's wife stayed back as Tim investigated.
Tim knew the Friedleys, and by the number of cars, he became worried. Had Vicky gone to bed and forgotten to blow out a candle? How did this happen? He called out to see if anyone was home, but he didn't hear anything. Tim walked down the driveway, and to his right, he saw a dark shape illuminated by the flames. It was a deep industrial rusted wheelbarrow with what looked like a mannequin inside.
It is never a mannequin, is it?
Well, as Tim's eyes adjusted, it appeared that the mannequin had arms and feet raised, and it was charred with no hair and no clothing. He saw low flames in the interior and figured either this was a terrible joke or something very sinister. Tim looked around for movement, but there was no one in the driveway or the wilderness. But he didn't stick around in case it was a gas leak. The neighbors waited for the fire department to arrive and watched the flames consume the home. Riverside County CAL FIRE responded to the call from Alpine Road and raced down Highway 74, a dirt road big enough for only one car. On the way there, they nearly collided with a red truck coming from the opposite direction. Even with the sirens on, the fire truck had to pull over at the last minute to let the red truck pass, and they noticed that there was one person in the truck cab.
It was a 20-minute drive from the station, and the firefighters arrived at 10:12 p.m. The house was already destroyed. Flames expelled from every door and window, eating through the walls. Neighbors crowded around speculating about what may have happened. Since the flame started quickly, Tim already thought that this could be an arson. John Wood, another neighbor, said he'd seen the flames from his balcony and noticed a car driving into the distance. The fire department put out the fire in the wheelbarrow and worked to get the house under control. At 10:30, the house entirely collapsed. It took over 4 hours to put out all of the flames, and the only parts of this house that were left were the foundation and the far exterior wall. This is why fires are so horrifying, because they destroy everything in their path. They're unforgiving, and there's just nothing left. We have pictures that we're going to put up on the screen. It's down to just like the foundation and some like rods coming out.
Detectives Benjamin Ramirez and Jeff Bompensiero were notified of the fire just before 10 p.m. And as Kimbyr said, it's never a mannequin. It wasn't a mannequin in the wheelbarrow. It was a person, and it appeared to be a homicide.
And I wasn't making light of this, but in true crime, it's a saying that it's never a mannequin. It's unlikely that what someone is witnessing when they think it's a mannequin is really a mannequin. Sadly, it's usually a deceased person. And in this case, it was, and it's extremely horrific.
At 11 p.m., Ron was heading to bed when he got a call from his buddy Jeff, the man who had introduced him to his wife. Jeff said, "Ron, how are you doing?" Ron said, "Good. What's up, Jeff?" Jeff then asked Ron where he was, who he was with, and then said, "Ron, I have some bad news. I'm up here in Pinion, and Vicky's house is burned down. There's several bodies that we found, and I hate to say this, but Becky's car is in the driveway."
Oh my God, that is just heartbreaking.
Ron was on autopilot. After so many years in the force, he expressed no emotion and said he would be there first thing in the morning. Ramirez got to the scene at 1 a.m. on the 18th, and the flames were still burning. He processed the scene with David Eichelt and Greg LeClaire, taking pictures and videos while fire experts assessed the damage. Once the flames were out, an expert determined that this was arson. Based on the burn patterns, which looked like liquid splashed along the floor, the fire had been started in 2 areas of the house with a flammable liquid much like gasoline. There were unopened gas containers in the garage and 1 opened gas container by the entrance of the house, close to the pour pattern. They checked for traces of gasoline, but there were none, meaning the fire had burned through all of it.
Close to the entryway, where the laundry room would have been, was a body so badly burned they were unable to identify who it was. Another body was in the kitchen area near the garage. It was impossible to tell if they had died before or after the fire started, and if they had fallen from the second story, which was no longer there. That's where the bedrooms are located before the house collapsed. Also in the wreckage, responders found 4 firearms, which had melted and left behind only the warped metal frames. There were 2 handguns and 2 rifles. They wondered if these guns may have been involved in this crime. The VINs of 5 vehicles were checked. 1 belonged to Becky and 3 belonged to John and Vicky. The 5th belonged to Drew, who was away abroad. 200 feet north of the entrance of the house along the driveway was the wheelbarrow. It was only 250 feet from the main road. Ramirez made the assumption that the person inside was 18-year-old Becky, and she had been set on fire with gasoline since there weren't any combustibles in the basin. Her upper body was badly charred, but her legs, positioned outside the wheelbarrow, were not. She was still wearing 2 white socks and 1 white Globe tennis shoe. The other was missing. Around the wheelbarrow was an ink pen with the label Riverside Sheriff's Association and a badly burnt baby doll. It's so creepy. It really looks like something out of a horror movie. In the wreckage of the house, they found charred photographs of Becky and her friends. One was Becky and Robert, and another was a selfie with Jeannie. Investigators were horrified. Whoever had murdered Becky and her family, they had posed her body alongside this driveway so that police or anyone that walked by would see her. So they immediately suspected that she could have been the target. Vicky and John had been killed either because they were witnesses or worse. The perpetrator could have wanted to make Becky suffer by seeing her loved one suffer. These, of course, were all assumptions from the information they were gathering from the scene, but they couldn't be sure what happened yet and why.
Around the wheelbarrow were footprints and a single wheelbarrow tire track that led from the house uphill into the wilderness. It cut deep into the earth, likely because of the weight of Becky's body, and it led 550 feet into an empty field, where the track finally ended. Alongside the track were two sets of footprints that sank into softer areas of the dirt. One set of footprints was in a line with the wheelbarrow track, indicating they were from the person pushing it. The other set was walking alongside, meaning that they were two perpetrators transporting Becky's body. A few prints were angled across the tire track, indicating someone trying to maneuver the wheelbarrow, and at one point the person moving the wheelbarrow switched out with another person. One wore Vans and the other wore DVS sneakers, like the ones we will show on the screen.
In the field where the wheelbarrow track started, there was a third type of footprint that matched Becky's Globe sneakers. Unfortunately, they couldn't find that other Globe shoe. These footprints went in a variety of directions, including a disturbance 20 yards away from where the wheelbarrow tracks began, indicating there had been a struggle. It's interesting what they can find out from looking at all that, but I can just envision it in my head. Like there's a struggle, there's the two people, they have the wheelbarrow, they're together, they switch out, maybe they're maneuvering it because of the weight. It's actually very scary thinking about that. The strange thing was that there were no footprints or wheelbarrow tracks leading away from the house. So they weren't sure how the wheelbarrow got to the hill from the house in the first place. The only way to get to the field was to drive up the hill with a truck or motorcycle or walk up the hill from the house. And there weren't any footprints leading that way. Why had this struggle happened so far away from the house? It was impossible to know for sure. But after the sun came up, LeClaire and criminalist Rick Takanaga took photographs and imprints of these footprints. Unfortunately, they were never able to determine the exact shoe size. The dirt was soft enough to spread out when someone stepped on it, so they weren't as clear and they couldn't make a measurement.
Not like the Kotow murders.
Exactly, not like the other case we did. That's a little bit different. Those were like bare feet, but you would think that they could at least have an estimate, but they never could get that.
Also, Detective LeClaire found a crumpled business card in the area where the struggle occurred. The business card was pretty clean, like it hadn't been in the elements for a long time. It read Pro-Life Catholic Ministries, with an email at the bottom for a woman named Marie Widman. It was an important clue, and LeClaire collected it before taking a picture of it where it was found, but said he later repositioned it and took a picture, in his words, exactly as it sat there in the dirt. Vicky, Jon, and Becky's bodies were taken into proper identification, and everything else would be processed for DNA and fingerprints, including Becky's shoe and socks, the gas cans, the 5 vehicles, the sheriff's office pen, the wheelbarrow, and the business card.
The morning of the 18th, Tanya woke up to an officer knocking at her door in El Dorado County. He told Tanya to call her father, and when she did, Ron was already crying. He said her mother's house had burned down, and then a fire had killed everyone inside, including Vicky, Jon, and her younger sister, Becky. Tanya's heart broke. As an officer herself, she'd sworn to protect the people around her, and she hadn't been able to protect her youngest sister. She immediately assumed her mom fell asleep with a lit cigarette, or there had been a gas leak. She called Drew to tell her the news. Kitty, who is Jon's daughter, was devastated when she found out that her dad had passed away.
But the rumors started circulating around Pinyon Pines. Some people thought Jon got caught up in a bad drug deal. Others thought Ron was taking revenge on his ex-wife. Tiffany wondered if Ron had an enemy from his time working in the sheriff's department. I mean, after all, he had just retired a year prior. Perhaps a convict got out of jail and gone to Ron's house hoping to kill him and not realizing he'd moved out years ago. Or maybe they decided to take out their anger on Ron's daughter and ex-wife.
There's always rumors at the beginning of investigations, and it was possible that Ron was involved, since he was Vicky's ex-husband. When Ron arrived around 11 a.m., he was crying, and he was taken in for an interview. He told the officers he couldn't think of anyone that would do this. In his time as a sheriff, he said he didn't think he had arrested anyone dangerous or vengeful enough to burn down his house. But he mentioned Becky's phobia of fire. Anyone close to her would have known that she had those scars, and also known that fire really freaked her out. So for her to die this way, it just seemed connected somehow. Plus, he's been in law enforcement, so he has experience and he thinks the way criminals would. But of course, he also knew that he would be a person of interest given his relationship to the family. When asked where he was at 9:30 p.m. the previous night, Ron said he was 12 hours away. When asked if he knew about a wheelbarrow at the house, Ron said he left a lot of things behind when he divorced Vicky. He'd left behind a wheelbarrow, But he couldn't be sure if that was the same wheelbarrow from the crime scene, or if that wheelbarrow belonged to Vicky and Jon. In his interview, Ron didn't realize he was someone they were truly looking into until they asked him to take a polygraph, which he agreed to, and it was administered by one of his friends in the department. And afterward, Ron was told that it was the best test given in the operator's career. But as you know, a polygraph is not fact. Ron also gave his DNA, phone records, and an alibi so he could be ruled out as a suspect. Turns out he had been contacted on his landline and his cell phone the night of the murders, and neighbors in Northern California had seen him outside of his house.
Not many people knew that investigators thought Becky was the target, but the authorities turned their attention to her social group, wondering who knew about her fear of fire and would have something against her, and possibly her family. They had options: her boyfriend of 2 months, Jacob Santiago, her best friend, Javier Garcia Jr., who had actually shown up at the crime scene and questioned the officers that morning of the 18th, as well as her ex-boyfriend, Robert Pape. On the 18th, all three of these men were interviewed. So let's start with Becky's boyfriend, Jacob Santiago. He told the cops he was innocent and that they should talk to Javier, who was Becky and his friend. Jacob had actually met Becky through Javier and also learned she passed away through Javier. In fact, Javier and Becky were supposed to be together in the hours before she was killed.
And even though they were just friends, everyone knew Javier had wanted to be more than friends with Becky, but she didn't feel the same way, so they remained platonic. I've always been told that guy friends are really just waiting for their chance to get with you, and that's why they stick around. But I know it's not always true, but throughout my childhood and teen years, it was true for the most part.
Well, Javier and Becky talked every day, either in person, on the phone, or by text message, and the two of them had plans to go on a late-night hike. But Becky canceled on Javier the last minute. So around 7 or 8 p.m., Javier supposedly was driving around the mountains with plans to see Becky and wasn't able to go. Instead, he rode around to Anza, a town 20 minutes away from Pinyon Pines. Jacob wasn't sure what time Javier got home, but he said the two of them had talked extensively about what happened to Becky. Jacob agreed to having his cell phone records searched, but he warned officers that his cell phone was turned off most of the day to conserve battery. He'd only turned it on once in the evening to send messages, so his cell phone would not give him an alibi.
That's very interesting, since we know from other cases that turning off cell phones can point to guilt. But officers had already interviewed Javier for 2 hours on the 18th after he showed up at the crime scene with two of his friends. And clearly they were going to have to interview him again because he was suspicious. What was interesting was that Javier Garcia Jr. was the son of Javier Garcia Sr., who worked for the district attorney's office, and his mother was Bonnie Garcia, an assemblywoman for the state of California who was running for state senate. So he had connections. Javier told the officers that he was grieving and struggling to process his best friend's death, and that he and Becky saw each other every day leading up to the crime, but he swore he wasn't involved. Javier said on Thursday, September 14th, he and Becky were hanging out at his place when Becky called her ex-boyfriend, Robert. He distinctly remembered Becky and Robert planning a night hike for Sunday evening around 7 p.m. Robert asked if Vicky and Jon were going to be there because Robert didn't think Vicky liked him very much. After all, he had broken up with their daughter, understandable. Javier just wasn't sure why Becky was calling Robert because at this time, Becky and Jacob were still together. He assumed Becky wanted to smooth things over with Robert and maybe just stay friends, since they'd been in no contact for months at this point. So yeah, he did wonder why they would be back in contact, but remember, Becky was a helper and a fixer. She didn't like when things went unresolved, so maybe she just wanted some type of closure.
On the next day, Friday, September 15th, Javier said he went to a party at night in Pinyon Pines with his friend, Bo Nash. They got drunk and couldn't drive home. In the early hours of Saturday morning, the 16th, Becky picked them up in her car and drove them to Vicky's house. It was only one of 5 times Javier had been to Pinyon Pines, and there Javier and Bo slept off the alcohol, and Javier told Becky it would be fun to hike in the wilderness behind the house, since they were always hanging out in the valley. Well, on Saturday morning, Becky drove them back to their cars. Javier didn't see her until Sunday morning, the 17th, when he picked Becky up from her Saturday to Sunday night shift at Denny's. She slept over at Javier's apartment, and when she woke up, They got a late lunch and Becky left Javier's at 4:30 to go back to Pinyon Pines for her 7 o'clock hike with her ex-boyfriend Robert.
It does sound weird that she's dating Jacob, but agreeing to go on a hike with her ex. But everyone has different boundaries, and Becky and her best friend Javier texted and called the rest of the evening. Becky had actually asked Javier to join her on the hike with Robert, since Robert was bringing his friend Christian Smith. And at that point, Javier was joyriding around Anza. So he said he's about 20 minutes away, and he headed for Becky's thinking he was going to go on the hike. But just minutes later, Becky had apparently changed her mind. And according to Javier, she called to say he probably shouldn't come. She didn't want the hike to get awkward in case Robert wanted to possibly talk to her privately about something, and she didn't want him to think she was dating Javier or he was more than a friend. So Javier didn't go. He said their last call was at 6:40 p.m. Soon after that, Becky texted him to say that she just put on her hiking clothes and Robert was driving up the hill to meet her. The investigators were confused why Becky would be so concerned about Robert thinking that she was dating someone else when they had both moved on. She had a boyfriend, but Javier told them that Jacob and Becky actually broke up 2 days before this, on Friday, September 15th, which is interesting because Jacob never mentioned this to the officers. So had the breakup gone badly? Javier said it was actually an amicable breakup, but if they were withholding the breakup from the police, there was a potential motive there. And if Jacob and Javier were working together, it wouldn't be hard to come up with a story to pin murder on Becky's ex, Robert. This sounds deep, and we know that sometimes these love triangles or bad blood can lead to something fatal.
Javier told investigators that he called Becky after her hike to see how it went and what Robert and her talked about. She had an 11 p.m. night shift at Denny's, and he wanted to know if she needed to sleep over the next morning. It was easier for Becky to sleep over at Javier's after her shift and go to her college classes in the afternoon, without driving 40 minutes up to Vicky's house in Pinyon Pines. Javier called Becky multiple times, but Becky didn't answer. At first, he wasn't concerned since the calls didn't always go through in the Pinyon Pines area. But when she wasn't responding after 11 when she was supposed to be at Denny's, he became worried. The next morning, Javier called Becky again and she still didn't answer. And that's when he found out on the news that her house had burned down. The investigator asked about Javier's alibi, and Javier said at 9:30 p.m. he was working with his mom's campaign manager to prepare for a town hall meeting. It was the job of the campaign manager to do the advertising and marketing, and it would be bad for marketing if the soon-to-be senator's son got wrapped up in a murder case.
Yes, it would be. That's very interesting. If he's trying to market his mom's campaign, but he's also wrapped up in a crime, it wouldn't look good. The investigator also asked to see Javier's shoes. When Javier said, "Oh yeah, you're gonna see my footprints up there," he explained that on Friday, when he and Beau went to Becky's to sober up, they did go on a walk around the property, and I thought that was very interesting. So he showed his shoes to the officer. It didn't match up with the Vans or the DVS prints. But if Javier was familiar with the property, he might have dropped something there, like that sheriff's pen. The officer also asked if Javier or anyone he knew owned a red truck. Due to that red truck that was intercepting the fire truck when they were coming up the hill, Javier said that his friend Nick did drive a red truck. Another person to be added to all of this, but Javier explained that Nick lived in Pinyon Pines and he just happened to be driving down into the valley that night and that he didn't even stop and pull over. Well, with all of this information, investigators were wondering what happened between Robert and Becky from 7 p.m. to 9:45. So they get in touch with Robert, and he agreed to an interview with Detective Scott Michaels. Robert told Detective Michaels that his romantic relationship with Becky did not end on good terms. He said Becky was responsible for the relationship imploding. She'd been drinking at a party in January, and she was unfaithful. Robert found out from someone else that she'd cheated on him, and he was so angry that he broke up with her. Now, he said he was happily dating his girlfriend, Sarah, and had no reason to do any harm to Becky, and they had both moved on. He said that after their breakup, Becky stayed in touch. He also said she was, quote, obsessed with him and told him she dreamed of taking her own life if he didn't want to get back together. But Then Becky mentioned another guy she was dating. That's Jacob. And Robert said he decided it was best if he went no contact because Becky was clearly trying to make him jealous with her messages. And this also made his girlfriend Sarah upset. So 2 months passed in silence before Becky finally reached out again on Saturday the 16th. Not Thursday, like Javier had said. On Saturday, which was the day before the bodies were discovered, Robert said he was hanging out with his best friend Christian when he explained that Becky actually stopped by his house unannounced and was just sitting outside the house in Drew's car. So he went out there and they had about a 5-minute conversation. And according to him, it was Becky who asked Robert and Christian if they wanted to go on a hike with her. Robert said, "We'll see." And when she left, Robert then turned to Christian and said there is no way we're going hiking with her. He was just trying to let Becky down easily. He didn't want to get back together with her, and he also thought that she was still dating Jacob and trying to just rub this in his face that she had a new boyfriend.
Well, what was clear was that Robert was no longer interested in Becky. He didn't like what she had done to him by being unfaithful, and now she's starting to get into his business when he clearly moved on with someone new. But if Robert was in a happy relationship with Sarah, would he kill his ex?
I don't know.
When asked about his alibi, Robert said that on Sunday the 17th, he was working at Not Soak City. It's a water park in the valley with Christian. They'd worked there all summer as lifeguards. Robert said he worked there until 6, and then he decided to slide backward down a water slide without the water turned on. When a supervisor saw his reckless behavior, Robert was not only reprimanded, but also fired.
I heard they're really strict there. So, I mean, they would be anywhere that's really dangerous, especially for a lifeguard doing that. But I have heard that Knott's especially is very, very strict with their employees.
I feel like you'd get some pretty major burns.
It's just not safe. Like, you should be being very careful.
Afterward, he said he drove to his mom, Kathleen's house and talked with her about losing the job. Kathleen suggested Robert attend Catholic Mass to repent for what he had done and come to terms with what he should do going forward. Robert was very religious and agreed it was a good idea, so he went. By this time, the Mass at their usual church was already over, so Kathleen suggested Sacred Heart Church, which might have a service. Christian usually came with Robert to Sunday services, so Robert called Christian and invited him to the service, and Christian picked him up in his car. When Detective Michaels asked Robert what car Christian drove, Robert said it was a 1973 Hearst Oldsmobile.
It's like a very old, like, muscle car. And I'm going to show you Sacred Heart Church on the map. It's in Palm Desert, right at the entrance to Highway 74, which leads up to Pinyon Pines. But it's still about a 35-minute drive. The boys said they were on their way there when Robert called Sacred Heart to make sure they hadn't missed the service. But it was already over. So Christian turned around and drove to Cathedral City, where his dad, John Smith, lived with Christian's great aunt. Now, Robert explained that Christian's dad was out of town at the time. He'd gone on a trip. And Robert told Detective Michaels that he wasn't even sure if Christian's great aunt saw them or not, but they for sure were there playing video games for about an hour. And during that time, Becky called Robert to ask when they were going to be going on their hike. Then Robert said that Becky told him she invited one of her friends, a guy from the Marines. At first, I was guessing that that was Javier, because that's who we know was also invited. Well, Robert told Detective Michaels that he had never planned to go in the first place, and now he really didn't want to go, considering there was going to be another guy going. So he told Becky he wasn't going to meet up with her, and Becky got upset. She called several more times, and Robert said that he and Christian finally decided to turn off their phones. Again, this is interesting that they too said they turned their phones off, just like Jacob had mentioned. And I swear, my phone's never off. But then I thought about when this was, and maybe back then it was more common because they had less options to kind of like silence your phone.
Right. Well, after playing video games, Robert said that Christian showed him his new paintball guns he'd bought from a mutual friend. Then they headed to an empty field near James Workman Middle School in Cathedral City to try out the new paintball guns, and they were there from 8 to 10 p.m. Robert mentioned that they invited their friend Sam Gayer to play, but Sam said he was out of town and couldn't make it. Robert said once they were done, Christian drove him home, but they did make a pit stop at an AM/PM gas station on Date Palm Drive.
Which would mean that when that neighbor of the Friedleys, Tim, saw the house going up in flames at 9:55, the guys would have been at the gas station, and Robert said he was buying some chapstick. Christian dropped Robert off at his apartment at 10:30 p.m., and Robert said that the rest of the night he hung out with his cousin who lived just across the street. They played some video games together. Detective Michaels recalled the firearms that were found inside the home. So he asked Robert, "Do you own any firearms?" Now, Robert not only insisted he never went to Becky's, he said that him and his family did not own guns. But he did say that Christian's dad had guns, but that he took the guns with him on that trip. And he didn't know anything about a red truck, and he didn't know anyone that owned a red truck. When asked what he knew about the crime, Robert said this, quote, "They found 3 people. 2 people were sexless, unrecognizable. One was found in a wheelbarrow, a female, about 20 years old. The whole house caught fire," end quote. I've actually never heard someone describe a person as sexless. I think he meant the gender was unable to be determined due to the damage to the 2 other bodies. But there was something else. This information raised a red flag for Detective Michaels because they hadn't posted anywhere in the media that Becky had been found in a wheelbarrow. So he asked where Robert got this information, and Robert said, from Javier. He said that Javier called him that very morning on the 18th, presumably after he visited the crime scene, to tell him that Becky had been murdered. So Detective Michaels was shocked. Tim, the first witness, thought there was a mannequin in the wheelbarrow. Why would Javier assume from talking to the neighbors that that was Becky? Had he heard something from investigators? Had he seen the wheelbarrow 250 feet from the road? I mean, he could have put 2 and 2 together. But they wondered, did he know something?
Well, after hearing this, Javier was interviewed again on the 19th, but investigators didn't ask him directly about the wheelbarrow. But they did want to know what Javier said he saw from the crime scene from the street, because the investigators hadn't let him pass the crime scene tape. Javier said he called Robert on the 18th to say something happened to Becky, and again today on the 19th to ask what he knew about Becky's murder, since he knew Robert had plans to go hiking with her that night. But Javier explained that Robert told him he canceled the plans because Becky was bringing her friend from the Marines.
Okay, so now I was thinking the guy from the Marines must be someone else besides Javier. Because why would Robert be telling Javier that there was this guy coming from the Marines if it was Javier that was supposed to be going?
Right, so maybe there was someone else that the investigators had to pin down. On the 19th, Robert returned to the station and offered to give another interview if it would be helpful to the investigation. Officers repeated most of the questions. Robert said that Javier told him that Becky kept a cabinet of letters and pictures of Robert in her house. Robert implied that Javier was possibly jealous of Becky's obsession with him, and Robert wanted nothing to do with this drama.
Right, but Robert seemed to be the source of all the drama.
Right.
Days after the murders, Becky's friend Jeannie McDaniel came to the station to offer her opinion about what happened. She and most of Becky's family actually thought that Robert could be involved. Jeannie explained that in November of 2005, when Becky and Robert were still together, she went on a girls' trip with Becky, and Becky's phone was blowing up the entire time with 20 to 30 messages from Robert back to back. Becky told her friends that Robert was being really annoying, but Jeannie thought that was harassment. Robert was being jealous and possessive, and the moment Becky was out of his sight, he wanted to intrude on her fun and be on her mind 24/7. That does seem pretty excessive, but maybe he was worried because she was away and not answering her phone.
Well, when they broke up, Jeannie said Robert was angry that Becky dated other people. He could date Sarah, but he still wanted control over Becky's love life. Their texts to one another were out of control. Jeannie said that 3 weeks before she died, Becky was hanging out with her when she said in a dramatic, pissed-off voice that Robert threatened to kill her. He had said, quote, "If I can't have you, no one can," end quote. Becky knew Robert hadn't taken the breakup well, but she didn't take him seriously. She wasn't scared of Robert. She had dated him over a year and just thought he was having a hard time coping with the fact that they were no longer together. Jeannie trusted Becky's judgment, but now she wasn't sure.
Jeannie also told the investigators that Becky was so much happier dating Javier. And yes, you heard me right. I didn't misspeak. I said Javier, not Jacob, because Jeannie actually thought Becky and Javier were together, not Jacob. She'd seen pictures of them cuddling with frosting around their mouth, and Becky loved talking about Javier's mom, Bonnie, running for the Senate. That's kind of interesting. If she was truly dating Javier and not Jacob, why would she be keeping that from one of her best friends. It was all looking quite confusing and sort of giving off the love triangle vibes. But was any of this enough to amount to a family being murdered? That was the question.
Well, Jeannie mentioned Becky's fear of fire and said that Robert knew about the burns on Becky's body, and because of that fact, she believed Becky was targeted.
But to be fair, we know from watching and doing like a lot of true crime cases that fire is a very common way for perpetrators to cover up their crimes. But I do understand the correlation that Becky's loved ones were making because they knew how scared she was of fire.
Plus, this seemed to line up with all the rumors that were going around Pinyon Pines. For example, Tiffany, Becky's sister, mentioned Robert as well and said he was a serious, unemotional guy who clearly loved Becky but didn't respect her. Tiffany had witnessed what she described as hitting matches, where Robert and Becky would jokingly start hitting each other, and that many times that escalated until Becky had bruises on her arms.
I don't think that hitting anyone is acceptable.
No.
I don't know why this sounds like it would be a fun joke. I just can't imagine hitting you or anyone else. It's a little strange.
Well, another person named Brandon Harrison came forward, and he too mentioned Robert, saying that both Robert and his best friend Christian were actually pyromaniacs.
I'm sure that everyone knows what this is, but if not, it's someone who enjoys intentionally setting fires.
Well, Brandon said that he remembered Robert and Christian messing around with a fire and a mattress while Becky was present, and Becky was upset and withdrawn afterward and refused to talk to her boyfriend. So Robert knew about her fear and wanted to make her uncomfortable. But just because Robert had a bad track record didn't mean he was the only one who knew about Becky's fear of fire, or that the murders were even connected to that fear. Recall that Jacob and Becky had broken up just 2 days before her death, and Javier was close enough to Becky to have seen her scars too. So if they were going with that theory, there would be many other people to look at.
And at this point, the Riverside Sheriff's Department ruled out things like a meth-related murder because at first, there was another theory floating around that these murders were drug-related. But they concluded that this was not a random act of violence. Even so, the investigation stalled. There were so many homicides that week that Sheriff Boone Pensiero stepped down as the lead investigator, and Gary LeClaire took the lead on the case. After 11 days on September 28th, Robert's best friend Christian was finally interviewed. He corroborated Robert's story. He was pretty stoic during the interview, but that might be because he mentioned he wasn't close with Becky. He said that Robert and Becky had a toxic relationship, and he thought she was a bad influence on him. He clearly wasn't a fan, which is not that uncommon. We usually side with our friends and we want the best for them. And Christian explained that Becky came over Saturday to plan that hike, and Robert agreed to go, but he actually planned not to. Christian said they weren't even sure what day Becky was planning to go on the hike with them. When Becky called the very next day, they figured it was about the hike. And Christian said that they let their phones ring and ring before just turning them off altogether. And Christian said after he took Robert home that night, he went to the house of his girlfriend, Jackie Muto, and they just hung out.
When asked what type of car he was driving Sunday night, Christian said it was his dad's white Acura. The investigator noticed the difference between Christian and Robert's testimony.
Remember that Robert said that Christian was driving the muscle car?
Right, so the investigator asked Christian why Robert had mentioned an Oldsmobile. Now, Christian said that it was his car, but it was in the shop. So that night, he said he'd been driving the Acura. It must have been a mistake. Maybe Robert was so used to Christian driving the Oldsmobile, he just figured that that's the car they took. He confirmed that he and Robert did visit an AM/PM gas station after playing paintball. So investigators headed for the gas station a week and a half after the triple homicides to see if they could gather any CCTV footage. Unfortunately, the gas station had to automatically erase the surveillance footage, and they do it every 7 days. So any evidence that had been there had been gone. There was nothing to corroborate their stories, but both men willingly gave DNA and fingerprint samples, so now they would have to wait for the results.
By the end of the month, Dr. Glitman had finally completed the autopsies for Vicky, Jon, and Becky. And like usual, I want to be as transparent as possible about what happened, even though in these cases it could be very brutal to hear about it. But I will start with Jon. Jon had received very severe thermal injuries, so they gave him a full body x-ray. He was found in the kitchen area of the home, and it was determined that he had actually been shot in the chest with a shotgun. There were multiple 7.5 birdshot pellets discovered in his torso, as well as one plastic casing, also known as shotgun wadding. He'd been killed with a 12, 16, or a 20 gauge shotgun, all of which could hold this type of ammunition. The toxicology report revealed a low carbon monoxide level, so Jon had been set on fire after he was killed.
And Vicky received the worst of thermal injuries. She too was x-rayed. She had been found in the laundry room and was determined that she too had been shot. There was evidence of a wound on her head. Since the flames had obscured the entrance wound, the doctor was not able to confirm what direction she was shot. The bullet was in her left temporal scalp. It was either a 10mm or a 40 caliber bullet. From what could be gathered, it appeared there could be several different types of firearms that she'd been shot with. It could have been a Glock Model 20, a 22, or a 23, which shot a 10mm and 40 caliber bullets, or a 40 caliber Smith & Wesson, or a Heckler & Koch, shortened to just H&K, but she could have also been shot with guns that belonged to Car Arms or Israel Military Industries. They could not be 100% sure.
Yeah, there were a lot of different firearms that could be responsible for that type of ammunition, so they were just writing down every type that could be possible so they could look for those.
Right. However, they did confirm that Vicky was also killed before the arson.
The bullets were examined by gun expert Takanaga, and he said the 4 shotguns that Jon kept in the house were not responsible for these murders. The perpetrators brought guns with them to the crime scene. Becky's body was so badly burned that they could not tell how she died. Her death was ruled as homicidal violence. They did not find a bullet, meaning she could have been strangled or something like that. And if she was shot, the bullet would have exited her body, and forensic investigators never found a bullet or shell casing at the crime scene. There was no soot in her toxicology report, so she too did not inhale any smoke. These deaths really upset me, but I am relieved that they did not have to suffer from the burns that they've received. It doesn't make it any better. It's terrifying, but at least they didn't have to suffer through a very long death like that. With this information, investigators asked neighbors if they had heard any gunshots that night, and nobody had. It was impossible to tell when this crime had occurred.
An arson analyst named Steve Carman had looked at the scene and determined that the house was most likely set on fire at 9:30 p.m. Another analyst said they thought Becky was set on fire before the house. Elaine Pope, a body burn analyst, placed the time Becky was burned at 9:55, which is when Tim first called 911.
I had no idea there was something called a body burn analyst, but I guess there's forensic investigators for everything.
I had no idea you could tell the time which a body was set on fire.
It's very interesting. And with this logic, it's likely Becky was set on fire second. If Tim first saw the fire at 9:55, but didn't see anyone leave, it's much more likely the shootings had occurred around 9:30. And the house and Becky were set on fire between 9:45 and 9:55. We can only guess whether Becky knew the fire was even involved, or if the fire was just set to destroy evidence and not to scare her like her friends thought. To honor their lives, Vicky and Becky had a joint memorial service in Santa Barbara on October 1st of 2006. 2 weeks later, another service was held in Cathedral City for Becky, Vicky, and Jon. Now, Daniela, Becky's cousin, remember her? We mentioned her in the beginning. She was very upset during these memorial services. She didn't like how the investigation was going. She told her mom, who was Vicky's sister, that in the first few days she had important information for the cops, but she didn't think they were taking it seriously. So she had her mom call the sheriff's department, and nobody followed up. This seemed to be a trend. The Pinyon Pines neighborhood was never canvassed. Javier's friend Nick, who owned that red truck, never interrogated, though it was unlikely he was responsible since they were looking for 2 perpetrators, but still, he could have been one of them. From the beginning, the change in leadership meant that this case was pretty unorganized. And I don't think it directly reflects on the officers, it's just the entire department. They were overworked, which is never a good excuse, but it was what was happening.
But what they had done was hone in on Christian and Robert to the point where they interviewed dozens of their friends and coworkers without focusing on evidence from others like Javier and Jacob.
I did find that to be interesting. And in these interviews, one water park coworker of Christian and Robert said that he actually went shooting with both of these guys over the summer.
But I thought Robert didn't own any guns.
I know. And that's interesting. Again, we're just mentioning the things that we thought were interesting. As far as I can recall, he did say that Christian's dad had guns, but this coworker said that Robert brought a Glock. So even though Robert denied owning a gun, he certainly had access to one. Another one of their friends brought a shotgun, and Christian didn't bring any guns. So at this point, they were still waiting on DNA and fingerprint evidence. So let's go there for a moment, since that is more concrete. When the DNA and fingerprints were analyzed by separate laboratories, the results didn't say much. The gas cans revealed nothing. Becky's shoes, well, the one shoe they found, were clean, no fingerprints on them, no DNA. Her socks did have 2 sets of male DNA on them.
But she was wearing one shoe, so it was unlikely that she was pulled up by her socks.
Right. That's exactly what they said. They said it was unlikely that she was being carried by her socks to the wheelbarrow because she had the one shoe on. The sock DNA results were inconclusive, meaning they didn't match up with Robert or Christian's. The wheelbarrow's handles had no fingerprints on them. One handle had no DNA, and the other handle had a partial DNA profile. It belonged to a male contributor, but again, it wasn't Robert or Christian, and would possibly be Ron or Jon. And there were no fingerprints on the Riverside Sheriff's pen. But there was DNA on it, a partial profile that, again, didn't match up with Robert or Christian. I know this can be confusing, but the bottom line is lots of stuff, but lots of nothing as well, because nothing matched. Becky's car yielded a fingerprint belonging to Bo Nash, which is Javier's friend, who she picked up on Friday night at that party. So they interview him and they get his cell phone records, and he's quickly cleared of suspicion. Otherwise, there was no other DNA in her car. The only thing left was that business card that they found.
Well, by now, investigators had already tracked down the woman whose name was on that card, Marie Widman. She worked out of Chino Hills 2 hours away and visited Catholic parishes in the Californian desert 4 times a year to conduct pro-life workshops. There, she distributed the business card. In 2006, she went to Sacred Heart Church, which wasn't Robert's main church, even though investigators thought it was. Marie told the police she did not know the Friedleys or the Haywards, but she knew Robert's mother, Kathleen Pape, because she'd volunteer at Sacred Heart that day.
Recall it was actually Robert's mom that insisted he go repent for getting fired at work and to go to Sacred Heart. She had already been interviewed and admitted that she was one of hundreds of Marie's volunteers, and they weren't friends. They had only exchanged a couple words. Kathleen also didn't remember even getting a business card.
Well, something else noted about this business card was that an anonymous source claimed that he was the one who found the business card, not Officer LeClaire. Apparently, the police had asked for help searching the area, so people band together to assist. But because it was an anonymous source, this couldn't be followed up on. So investigators assumed the card was given to Robert by his mom, Kathleen.
Which was, of course, just an assumption. And that does make sense because remember, the investigator didn't take a picture where he found it, maybe because he didn't find it. But the bottom line is the card was analyzed for fingerprints. And that December, 2 experts found 2 fingerprints on this card. A Cal ID analyst said these fingerprints were incomplete. They were bad quality and could not be compared to anyone. A forensic technician looked at the prints again in 2007 and said that one print was incomplete and the other did not match with Robert or Christian. And a part of me thinks, wow, they're really focused on these 2 guys, but not anyone else. But maybe they were comparing other people's DNA and fingerprints. I don't know.
So as far as the DNA, there was somewhat degraded DNA found from 2 other people on the card. At least one was male, since investigators detected a Y chromosome, but the male wasn't Robert. When they tested it against Christian's DNA, they determined he couldn't be ruled out. He was white, and Robert was Hispanic, and 1 in 320,000 Caucasian men matched up with the DNA that was found on the card, as opposed to the 1 in 1.1 million Hispanic men. So the odds were higher that a white man committed this crime, someone who had a similar DNA profile to Christian.
But they're also assuming that this card and the crime were connected at this point. I mean, I know that there will be things said later, so of course keep watching, listening, and figuring it out. But those odds don't pinpoint Christian, as you just said. It was 1 in 320,000 men, and this still is significant. And the DA believed that Christian's DNA was a positive match. Unfortunately, this was not enough evidence to arrest him or even search his house, because I'm not that good at math, but that's still not like totally conclusive. And that's because there was still reasonable doubt that this card ever belonged to Kathleen and that it was passed to either of these guys. The chain of movement from Marie to Kathleen to Robert to Christian to the crime scene was a pretty significant leap of logic. But to be fair, the church was over 35 minutes away. It wasn't super close by. And there was the connection that Robert and Christian planned to go there that same night. So it's interesting, though circumstantial. But you know that I love mapping locations. So I looked at where the closest churches were to this area, and all of them were at least 30 minutes away. Many of them were more than 30 minutes away. So that means that residents in Pinyon Pines had no choice but to travel a bit to go to church.
Well, luckily, they could access everyone's phone records, but it took 8 months for the warrants to go through. FBI Special Agent Kevin Boyles says this is normal, especially when working with 5 different companies to access data from Jacob, Javier, Robert, Christian, Jon, and Becky's cell phones, plus all of their landlines. It was a very long process.
We are going to break this down, and I'm going to start with Jacob, Becky's very current ex-boyfriend, since his activity record is short. His phone was powered off from 12 in the noon to 6 p.m. on the night of the murders. He turned it on for just 20 minutes and then turned it off again from 6:20 to about 10:15. At 10:23, 10:25, and 10:44, he called Becky. Jacob could have been at the crime scene, or he could have been halfway across the world.
Well, according to Javier's records, he told the law enforcement that the last time he called Becky was at 6:40 p.m., and then he drove through Anza at 7 p.m. This was correct. But he actually called Becky again much later than that. At 7:14, she actually placed a call to him, and at 7:35, Javier called her back. But I'm assuming she didn't answer because that same minute at 7:35, Becky called Javier, and again at 7:37.
And that was the very last call Becky ever made. This was also a normal amount of calls for them, considering the Freedley's houses in Pinyon Pines, it's remote, and there wasn't a cell tower there. Calls would often get dropped. So you'd have to call the person back again and again, jumping from cell phone to your landline until you got in touch with them. Also, Javier's phone was pinging off cell towers in Palm Desert as soon as it hit 7:45 p.m. It pinged off Rancho Mirage at 7:50 p.m. And at 8:07, the phone pinged off a tower in Cathedral City 7 times over the course of 2 hours. When the murders happened, Javier's phone appeared to be on the valley floor and not near the crime scene. He called Becky 4 more times before midnight and of course got no answer. And the next morning he called her another 4 times to figure out what happened.
Now on to Robert. He previously claimed Becky contacted him about the hike on Saturday, while Javier said it was Thursday. Well, it turns out Javier was right. Robert and Becky had a 10-minute phone call on Thursday the 14th, and they'd been texting ever since. On Saturday, there were 8 calls back and forth from Becky and Robert from 5:47 p.m. to 7:09 p.m. Becky called Robert called Becky, and they both initiated about half the calls. It didn't seem like Robert didn't want to talk to Becky. On the contrary, he was calling her back, so he wasn't exactly ignoring her calls like he made it sound.
Exactly. That was not 100% correct. Here's a full timeline of Robert and Christian's calls on September 17th. At 6:00 p.m., Christian called Robert. At 6:14, Becky called Robert, a 2-minute and 46-second call while he was getting off work. At 6:18, Robert called Christian to make plans to drive to the Sacred Heart Church. At 6:53, Robert called Becky. The call went to voicemail and pinged off Tower 707 in Cathedral City, meaning Robert was still at his mom's house. At 6:59 p.m., Becky placed a call to Robert and he either missed it or ignored it. Then at 7:01, Robert placed that call to Sacred Heart Church, which means he wasn't lying. He was trying to go to that evening mass, presumably. Then at 7:04, Robert called his friend Sam. Remember him? Him and Christian were asking if he wanted to go play paintball, but Sam was out of town. Well, at this time, Robert's phone connected to Tower 705. That's right in the middle of the desert where Highway 74 begins, near the Sacred Heart Church. It would have pinged off 705 if he was or wasn't driving to Pinyon Pines, because there's not a lot of towers in this area. And at 7:05 p.m., Becky called Christian. but he didn't pick up. And the call once again pinged off Tower 705. Then there's a call back from Sam to Robert at 706. They spoke for a couple minutes. At 709 and 710, Christian actually called Becky twice, which looked a bit odd considering he said he wasn't close with Becky. But since we know that he's Robert's really close friend, it appeared like Becky was just trying her best to get in contact with Robert, so she's calling Christian as well. It's not uncommon for someone to call a friend. But investigators did wonder what these calls were about. If they had no plans to actually meet with Becky, and they said they turned their phones off because they didn't want to speak with her, this contradicts their account of events. Maybe Christian was telling Becky that they weren't coming, or he was telling her they were on their way. But strangely, one of these calls pinged off Tower 523, 7 miles from Tower 705. So what this means is that one of the guy's phones was somewhere else at the same time, but we know that phones can choose a tower. But this could mean that Robert and Christian turned around and were taking the long way back to Christian's dad's house, or they were driving up the mountain and the phone was randomly connecting to other towers.
You see, the argument that Christian and Robert weren't near Pinyon Pines and their phones were pinging off random towers is that they climbed the mountain. It's the same argument against Javier being near the crime scene. Javier's phone was pinging in Cathedral City from 9 to 10 p.m., but it was just as possible that he was in Pinyon Pines and his phone was pinging off a random tower in the valley the entire time. Remember, Pinyon Pines is very remote.
Exactly. So this evidence isn't exact evidence either because it's too random. But going back to the call log, at 7:13 and 7:27 p.m., Becky called Robert. It went to voicemail, and his phone was connecting to Tower 745, which was at the base of the hill leading up to Pinyon Pines. So now it does look like they're heading in that direction. But then at 7:34, she called Christian, and that also went to voicemail. So it could have been partially true that at this point they were ignoring her calls. Finally, she contacted Javier, and then she just gave up on calling anyone else back. Or maybe she was too busy to reconnect with anyone before she was murdered.
But now it appeared Robert and Christian were driving up towards her house and lost reception. But they could also turn their phones off. From 7:25 to 9:55, both Robert and Christian's phones did not receive or make any calls, and that was unusual. So they became the prime suspects, and this is all the investigators had to go off of.
The investigators were arguing that it was very weird for a 17 and an 18-year-old not to use their phones for that long. However, they were together. So it's not like you would be calling the person you usually call a lot, but that's why they did become the prime suspects.
Well, Robert's girlfriend Sarah and his friend Sam called Robert several times, but their calls automatically went to voicemail. Then at 9:55 p.m., when the neighbor saw the flames over at the crime scene, that's when Christian's phone got reception again. He placed his final call, and it went silent for the remainder of the evening. At 10:23, Robert's phone pinged off of Tower 88 next to Christian's dad's house. At 10:30, he placed 2 calls to Sarah, who had been worried about him all night, and then the next morning, he gets a call from Javier. As they both stated, this call was to inform Robert that something bad had happened to Becky.
A few months after acquiring this evidence, the Riverside Sheriff's Department executed search warrants on Robert and Christian's homes. It was October 7th, 2007, over a year after Vicky, John, and Becky were killed. And all the officers collabed on this raid of their homes. Robert's house was searched by Bonpensiero, LeClaire, Patterson, Ford, Eckholt, Jenica, and Mullins, while another team led by Ramirez went through Christian's apartment. At Christian's, they found 2 shotguns, a 12-gauge single-barrel pump action, and a 12-gauge double barrel. They also found 40 caliber shells, but no handguns. The last thing they observed were a pair of black slip-on Vans shoes.
As for what they discovered at Robert's place, they found a collection of shell casings of all different varieties. One was a 40 caliber, another was a 10 millimeter casing. This wasn't uncommon for hobby shooters to keep a collection of shells, but the 40 caliber shell didn't match the Glock firing pin. They found a 12-gauge shotgun with 2 types of shells, a 00 buck and an 8 birdshot, which didn't match up with John's wounds. However, they did find a Black Hawk holster for a 40 caliber Glock pistol. The receipt dated September 2007, a month ago, and a full year after the crime. But maybe Robert already owned a Glock. The holster fit a Glock 17, 22, or 31, so the investigators would look for a Glock 22. They seized his Apple computer and discovered a pair of size 12 Vans shoes.
So in case that was confusing, they found a Glock pistol holster, which is one of the type of guns that could have been involved in this crime, but the gun was not found. What I think is interesting is that, again, both of these guys are like, no, we don't really have access to guns, and they've got ammunition and guns. Now, granted, this was a year after the crime, so they are perfectly allowed to own firearms, but it was just weird. And they both had Vans shoes. That's not uncommon. It's a very common shoe. And when both of these pairs of Vans shoes were compared to the Vans footprints at the scene, they were not a match. It just doesn't seem like this investigation's really going anywhere. But knowing that Christian owned shotguns, he was interviewed once again, and his DNA was swabbed one more time. Christian said on the night of the crime, he had been driving his dad's Acura, remember that? And he was on Highway 111 eastbound heading for Sacred Heart Church. And when they found out they missed the mass, he turned around at Lord Fletcher's restaurant near Country Club. I'll show you this on a map. If you follow the pings of Christian and Robert's phones with where they said they went, the pings match up perfectly with their story. There was a reasonable possibility that they both turned off their cell phones like they said they did. This was, of course, frustrating for LeClaire. He was convinced he had their perpetrators, but there was no surefire way to lock them up.
Well, let's look at the forensic evidence. Robert's Apple laptop was scanned for any messages that conveyed any intent to hurt Becky, and there wasn't much. But they did find a 100-page instant message conversation between a username called Buttercup10 or 10000000 and one called Love Me for Meal.
Okay, I remember some bad usernames from back when we used to use Instant Messenger, but they inferred that Buttercup was Robert and that Love Me was Sarah. What was your instant message name? Just say it.
Mine was my name.
Okay, creative. I'm asking the audience, what was your instant message or AIM name back then? I couldn't get creative. I saw the two first things on my desk. One was fresh squeezed orange juice box, and another one was security usage envelopes. So I just put them together and I was fresh usage, which was actually kind of cool sounding. And everyone asked me like where it came from, but I don't know how creative it really was. What about all of you? I'm sure we have cringy ones.
On January 18th of 2006, right after Robert and Becky broke up, there were messages where Sarah vented to Robert about her boyfriend cheating on her. Halfway through the conversation, Sarah says, quote, "Well, I'm not that good, haha. I mean, hey, I was cheated on by a professional crack whore," end quote. Clearly, she was upset with her ex.
I think it's odd that she refers to her ex-boyfriend as a crack whore, specifically because that implies he sells himself to get drugs, but okay.
Regardless of Sarah's choice and insult for an ex, what was more relevant was what Robert said next. He replied to her saying, "Yeah, well, I know where he lives, so we can professionally burn his house down." And then Sarah replies, "That's right, you're a little pyro." And Robert says, "I've gone through a 6-pack of matches already today."
I mean, he's joking, right?
But is he?
I don't know. It's 100 pages of instant messages, and they're picking one part of these messages. But he does follow up with, "I'm just kidding."
But then he goes on to tell her, "But if you want, we can go burn down his house together." Sarah says, no, that won't really resolve anything." And Robert says, "It'll make me feel good, and maybe you too. But you don't know until you try."
That's weird. I mean, it definitely seems relevant considering Becky's house was burned down and she was set on fire. But was this really evidence of Robert being involved? By this time, it had been over a year. Everyone close to Becky thought Robert and Christian would be arrested by now, but the sheriff's department couldn't find any concrete evidence. The head district attorney at the time, Ron Pacheco, put Assistant DA Bill Mitchell on the case. He said after that search warrant, investigators continued to work tirelessly to find a clue that would break open this case, but nothing. So in 2008, they applied for yet another search warrant, and this time it was denied. The leads had dried up, and Mitchell felt like this case was not able to be prosecuted. He got a job in San Diego, and yet another assistant DA was put in charge, and the case went cold. But Becky's dad, Ron, trusted that the sheriff's department was capable. Recall, he's former law enforcement, but he also slowly lost hope. 2 years after the homicide, Ron's old friend, Luis Bolaños, who had previously worked for the DA's office and was now a private investigator, called him up. Bolaños offered to take over the case at no cost. But Ron said he wasn't interested, and the reason why was because Bolaños had previously been fired for giving false information in a divorce hearing. And Ron wanted the sheriff's department to be successful, so he was sketched out by that. So more time went by, and in 2009, Arnold Schwarzenegger, if you guys remember, he was the governor of California, he got involved, and he offered a $50,000 reward for any tips that would lead to an arrest. A private reward was also offered, but still, they didn't get any leads.
Then, in October of 2011, someone called in with an anonymous tip. The caller said he worked at Not Soak City with Christian in 2007, a year after the triple homicide. And Christian came to work in a daze, looking at the mountains towards Pinyon Pines, and when asked why he wasn't focused on the pool, Christian said, "Something went wrong, and we torched the whole effing place," end quote.
Now that seems weird. Yeah. It's a year after the murders. So I'm thinking, did the caller get the year wrong? Did he see the reward and finally think of saying something? The caller admitted he didn't even want a reward and he didn't want to provide too much detail. But then why wouldn't he want to provide detail? The family only wanted justice. And while this tip was promising, it wasn't substantial enough to lead to an arrest. Finally, 6 years later, Ron decided to hit up Bolaños after all this time and ask for some help. And so much had happened that Bolaños had to get caught up on everything. Through interviews, he discovered Robert and Christian were both well-loved in their community. Robert was born in the area to his parents, Kathleen and Gregory. He was the third of 4 children. And after being fired from Not Soak City, he worked for a local AC company and actually ended up getting married to his girlfriend, Sarah. They went to Las Vegas in July of 2011 and got hitched. They lived together with their dog and their 2 cats on Rio Dulce Road. And Robert was dedicated to his church. And his sister, Christy, said he was a gentle, hardworking, honest man. And speaking of pretty eyes, I just want to say that Robert's sister, Christy, has 2 different color eyes. One is green and one is brown. I just wanted to point that out because as rare as it was, I was surprised to see even more green eyes.
As for Christian, he was born to John and Jana Smith and worked several years at Not Soak City, where he met and married his supervisor, Jackie. He joined the 2nd Ranger Battalion based in Seattle, Washington, and became a decorated war hero. He was deployed 4 times to Afghanistan and once to Iraq, earning 2 Purple Hearts for saving his fellow officers.
It seemed like both these guys were leading pretty normal, ordinary lives.
Well, maybe, but Bolaños was on Ron's side, and Ron believed these guys were the perpetrators, even though they had no criminal records. Bolaños wanted results, and he knew it would need to be something dramatic to get Becky's name back into the media, so he came up with a plan. He put up a billboard in the middle of the valley that advertised a $50,000 governor reward. And it was pretty dramatic. At the top left, it said, "Meet Becky." And underneath, there were 2 photos. One on the left was a before photo of her smiling happily. And then on the right was an after picture of Becky on fire in a wheelbarrow.
Well, it was actually a fake photo, but it was photoshopped to look real. And then underneath, it says, "Does this make you sick? Then do something about it. $50,000 reward, unsolved triple homicide," along with a hotline number. It was sure to get people's attention. And that same week, Bolaños held a press conference with Vicky and Becky's family right at the murder site. He interviewed Drew and Tanya, who asked all the people watching to come forward with tips. And guess what? It actually worked. They got 3,000 phone calls. But would these calls amount to anything substantial? Well, one of these tips came from Daniela Zermenio. You might remember this name again. This is actually Becky's cousin. She repeated her story to Bolaños. Daniela said on September 16th, the day before Becky's murder, she got a call from Becky, and Becky was upset. She said she was at work when Robert and Christian walked into Denny's and harassed and yelled at her, embarrassing her in front of her coworkers. According to Daniela, Robert was trying to convince Becky to go with him on a hike. And Daniela said Becky told her she didn't want to go on a hike with Robert, but she finally caved, telling him she would as long as he left Denny's right then and there. But Robert didn't leave. The Denny's manager allegedly had to actually remove Robert from the restaurant. Becky told Daniela that she was fed up with Robert, but she did want to go meet him for the hike because she wanted to put the relationship behind her once and for all. Before Daniela could ask any more, Becky lost service because she entered Pinyon Pines. And that was the last time Daniela talked to her cousin. I'm wondering why this was never followed up with in the first place, because Daniela had gone to the sheriff's office and given this tip. But now Bolaños latched on to Daniela's story. It's all he had. So I guess those 3,000 calls never amounted to anything, which is sad.
In September 2013, on the 7th year anniversary, Bolaños held another press conference, and this time Daniela was there. He'd also worked with a guy who calls himself Hollywood Herd. He's an actor and a director, and Bolaños connected with him to produce a graphic reenactment video to make the case go more public. They wanted to do this to put more pressure on the DA's office to solve the crime.
But there was an issue with Daniela's story. While it's definitely concerning, it didn't seem to add up. I know Daniela and Becky were very close, and I want to believe her story, like I'm sure many people did as well. However, Friday to Saturday night, Becky wasn't working. And it seemed as though Daniela just really wanted justice for her cousin, which is understandable. But the thing is, we know that Friday night into the early morning hours of Saturday, Becky picked up Javier from that party. However, on Saturday to Sunday night was when Becky was working. Unless Becky was upset about a shift that happened days before this timeline for when Daniela received this information didn't add up. And also, no one at Denny's ever confirmed that this confrontation happened, and you'd think they would, considering a murder occurred, a triple murder. And if it did happen, wouldn't you think that Becky's closest friend, Jeannie, would know about it? Wouldn't Javier? Wouldn't her managers? It was incriminating testimony against Robert, but it didn't prove he had any motive.
But Bolaños and Hollywood Herd had an idea. They thought of a way they can get Robert to talk. So one day, Bolaños went to Robert's house with Hollywood, and they pretended to film a tribute video where they were interviewing Becky's friends about the last time they'd seen her. They wanted Robert to contribute, hoping he'd say something about Denny's. But Robert says on camera, "Oh shoot, I guess that was some time ago," and he said he couldn't remember the last time he talked to Becky. So Bolaños asked if Robert had heard about an argument between Becky and someone at Denny's. Robert said he had no idea.
To be fair, nobody had heard about this argument, but it's strange to not remember the last time you saw someone that you cared about before they died. Because that's something you would think just sticks in your mind, even years later. But some people do push things that are traumatic out of their heads. But now that Bolaños was on the case, everyone was talking about Vicky, Jon, and Becky again. A man named Paul Zellerbach was the DA, and he had an election coming up. And he was feeling the pressure. Now, his opponent was a guy named Michael Hestrin, and he had the full backing of the sheriff's department. And the department was still presenting the case to the district attorneys on a regular basis. So in April of 2013, the prosecution requested further investigation. But in February 2014, Judge Becky Dugan signed off on a probable cause affidavit, and Zellerbach made a statement saying he was glad they could finally arrest the culprits, though he didn't say what evidence tipped the case over the edge. And I've looked through all the evidence. The only new information was the anonymous call from 2011 and Daniela's testimony. So was this case really to a point where it could be prosecuted? I don't know. But if it was, why would they hold off for 7 years?
At the time, the Sheriff's Association president, Mason, said that Zellerbach influenced the case to go to court to make himself look better. But of course, Zellerbach disagreed.
But we all know politics and how it works, so I wouldn't put it past him.
Right. He said he was offended that anyone would apply he would use a tragedy like this to his advantage. Regardless, Robert Pape and Christian Smith were arrested. Robert's arrest happened in town, and Christian's was at the airport while he was coming home from base.
Their arraignment was in March of 2014, and both pleaded not guilty, and their families insisted that they had nothing to do with what happened to Becky, Vicky, and Jon. Robert's wife, Sarah, and her friend said that Robert was never even jealous of Becky, and he didn't have a motive. Jackie, who had married Christian in April of 2013 and was now pregnant with their child, said she could not believe that the hero she married would even be considered a killer. Apparently, Robert's family had at least 10 to 11 people there all the time, but sometimes up to 30 or 40 people that would show up at these hearings to support Robert. There were times when the courtroom couldn't even accommodate all the attendees.
Jon's daughter Kitty said her heart was in her stomach at the hearing. The men who were believed to be her dad's killers were now 25 years old, and it was about time they got what was coming to them. Becky's dad, Ron, was thrilled. Every morning he smiled over his coffee, glad Becky's killers were behind bars.
But this case isn't over yet because Javier was expected to testify at trial against Robert, and that's when everything came out against him. Yes, Javier, born to Bonnie and Javier Sr., and at that point, he's now working in Nevada as a corrections officer. And not everyone thought he was innocent. Kitty had her doubts, and Becky's friends and Jeannie, they were all under the impression that Javier and Becky were actually dating in 2006. Jeannie had also heard that hours before Becky's sisters even found out that Becky had passed away, Javier already knew, and he had called Denny's to talk to the supervisor in that morning on the 18th to report Becky had passed away in a wheelbarrow. And still, no one knew how he found that out. Javier claimed that Robert just made up the story about him knowing about the wheelbarrow. He said he didn't know Becky was even in a wheelbarrow until he talked to Becky's sister on the 20th, 3 days later. So, did Robert lie?
Interesting. But one thing was for sure, the Denny's employees should have been interviewed. But now the restaurant was closed and nobody knew who had worked that weekend. It would be hard to go back all these years later and ask them what happened on a random shift so many years before.
That's true. I mean, you don't even know who. If you find them, you're going to be like, remember September, 17th, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, whatever. I would not be able to remember that. Javier's mother backed up her son. Her spokesperson came forward and said there was no evidence that he was involved in this crime, and he had no motive to kill Becky. They were best friends. But if you talk to Javier's peers, people that knew him around the town, they told a different story. One of Robert's friends said he knew Javier from high school and that Javier was strange. He was socially awkward and he was a loner until he graduated. And then he seemed cool. Javier's friend said he wasn't dating Becky, but that he did have a crush on her. They talked, they texted and called every single day. And he told Becky he was into her. Well, we told you, Becky didn't feel the same. But she was nice, so she always tried to let him down easily. But yeah, these rumors have been going on for a while. It's nothing that we haven't already heard. But then a woman named Megan Louder came forward. She said she knew both of them in high school and said Javier was obsessed with Becky. Becky told Megan that Javier never left her alone and she needed a break. In the weeks after Becky passed, Megan went with Javier and other friends to pay their respects at the crime scene. And this man, this Javier, led a tour around the crime scene and was explaining step by step how it happened. And that, to me, is odd. He said that Vicky and Jon were killed in the laundry room, and afterward, the killers took Vicky outside, dragging her by the hair, shot her, and then set her on fire inside of a wheelbarrow. Javier said Becky was probably alive when she was set on fire. Yikes, that definitely raises a red flag. When Megan and the rest of Javier's friends asked how he knew all this, he said that his mom and dad had access to police reports, which could have been true. It could have been true. I mean, maybe not, but at this time, it was all speculation either way.
Right, and no police officer reported Becky being dragged by her hair or Jon being killed in the laundry room. The toxicology reports show that she wasn't even alive when her body was burned. So why would Javier make all this up? Was it just a morbid fascination?
I thought about that, but that's kind of a stretch because this girl was someone that he liked, maybe loved, that he was really into. I think it would be really concerning to be fascinated by her murder. And then there was a man named Nicholas Crum, another witness. There's a lot of people in this case. He said that in the days after the murder, Javier went to the crime scene to take pictures. and that he showed everyone photos of the burnt wheelbarrow. And then they were hanging out in Javier's car, and Nicholas happened to see in Javier's trunk a gas container, a small shovel, and a roll of plastic bags. And of course, Nicholas can't remember exactly when this was, and Javier's car was totaled in October 2006, meaning it would have been a week or two after the crime. And Nicholas's girlfriend said she also saw these things, but she said they weren't in Javier's trunk. They were in a trunk of Jacob's roommate, Austin's trunk. I'm like, this is all so confusing to even keep track of. But now Austin, his roommate, has to come in and be interviewed and looked into, and he is found to own a shotgun. So Javier and Jacob both seem to have access to guns. And I'm sitting here thinking, anyone can get access to a firearm, even if you don't own one.
But then another guy we've already mentioned, Brandon Harrison, he's the guy who said Robert and Christian were pyromaniacs. He also knew Javier. After the killings, Javier told Brandon he drove on Highway 74 through Pinyon Pines the evening of Sunday, September 17th. He called Becky and asked to stop by before work. Becky said she didn't want him over because Robert was on his way for a hike. Brandon says he can't remember exactly, but he has a feeling Javier mentioned Jacob was with him when driving around Anza in Pinyon Pines.
I really hope that everyone's keeping up because this is hard for me to even remember, and I've read this several times. But remember Bo Nash, the guy whose fingerprint was in Becky's car? Well, he said Javier stalked Becky, and I've covered many stalking cases on my main channel, so I don't take the word stalking lightly. But according to Bo, he said that Friday night, when he and Javier stayed at Vicky's house, Becky and Javier went on several walks out in the wilderness behind her house. And he thought it was weird that they kept kind of escaping to have these little private one-on-one conversations. And then 2 weeks after the crime, Javier told Bo he was joyriding in Pinyon Pines that night, not Anza, but Pinyon Pines. And Bo thought Javier was faking his tears and that he had this fascination with Becky's murder, and that's concerning and scary. There was a lot of evidence against Javier, and that was just one of the reasons that he ends up hiring a lawyer, Eduardo Roy. The lawyer's job was to make sure Javier's mom, Bonnie, didn't get political flack for her son being involved in a murder case, and to rule out that there was no conflict of interest with Javier Jr. testifying for Becky when Javier Sr. was working for the district attorney's office. He's really, really close to all of this that's going on. So Javier was set to testify in March, but his attorney said in order for Javier to testify as a witness, the DA's office needed to clear him as not being a suspect. And Javier Sr. said that the only way he would allow his son to testify is if he was given immunity. And understandably, Javier was not granted immunity. And so therefore, he wasn't allowed, I'm doing air quotes, allowed to testify. I don't think he really needs his dad's permission, but this is the way that it went. Now, I know it might be easy to misinterpret why Javier Jr. asked for immunity and why it was refused. But if you think about it, the refusal came from Zellerbach. And he probably did this because he didn't like Javier Sr. because Javier Sr. supported his opponent, Mike Hestrin.
Well, after Zellerbach publicly said he wouldn't give Javier immunity, Javier Sr. took it upon himself to follow Zellerbach around town while he was off duty to catch him doing something wrong. And 7 months after Robert and Christian were arrested, Javier Sr. filmed a video of Zellerbach ripping down one of Mike Hestrin's campaign signs. Well, that's illegal, and that video went viral. Zellerbach was convicted of a misdemeanor, all because he refused to grant Javier Jr. immunity.
This is just so much drama, but I had to add it because it is related to this case and the people involved. But after this, Zellerbach was subpoenaed to testify in the case against Robert and Christian, probably to explain why this case took so long to be prosecuted. But in that same month, the charges against Christian and Robert ended up getting dropped, which was quite a surprise. And this is what was written in the district attorney's statement to the newspaper, quote, "Upon a closer review of the grand jury proceedings, the district attorney's office has determined that legal issues arose during the proceedings against defendant Pape and Smith that made it appropriate to dismiss the case at this time," end quote. And I wondered, what legal issues were they talking about? Was there really new evidence? Did they not have enough evidence? And you can also blame Zellerbach, or you could blame the prosecutors. In any case, Robert and Christian were allowed to walk free, and this seemed to be for no reason.
Becky's sister Tanya and her dad Ron were disappointed. To them, justice did not seem like it was being served. It felt more like a slap in the face, but for Robert and Christian's families, this was the best day of their lives. Christian's dad, Jon, said he felt numb and elated. In a news broadcast, Christian walks out of jail with Robert not far behind him towards his dad, wife, and newborn daughter. Christian's wife had given birth only 2 weeks prior.
It was a really emotional moment. Christian is holding his baby girl named Zoe for the very first time. And he says, I just want to be with my beautiful baby girl and my amazing wife and my loyal family and my brothers overseas, over in the military, who have been loyal to me throughout this whole thing. And Robert was hugging his mom and his sister, who never wanted to let him go. The families were so relieved that Robert and Christian could get back to their lives and put this behind them. But not everything remained the same. Robert's wife, Sarah, admitted that she had an affair while Robert was away, and they ended up getting a divorce, but they still remained friends. And I think you'll be glad to know that Mike Hestrin was elected instead of Zellerbach. And while they were starting from scratch in a decade-long investigation at this time, Hestrin was determined to solve this case for the sake of the Friedley and Hayward families.
Investigator Ryan Bodmer was now in charge of reprocessing all evidence, and he did so under the assumption that Robert and Christian were guilty. He wasn't looking at the evidence against Javier. Bodmer looked at the shoe prints again and the tread pattern, but they did not match any known shoes. He sent the business card to a new DNA processing lab and fingerprint analyst. He also looked at Robert and Christian's Verizon records.
And please remember, this is years later. This time, Bodmer tried to find the sector data, this is to do with cell phones, which could categorize which direction north, south, east, or west each call came from in relation to a phone tower. If they were able to get the sector data, they could figure out if Robert and Christian really were at the Sacred Heart Church or if they were headed up the mountain towards Pinyon Pines. Well, as promising as it seemed, there was some bad news. It had been too long, and the sector data was erased.
They really just could not catch a break.
They couldn't. And in 2015 and 16, a company called Gladiator Forensics was employed to test the cell tower coverage for this area. They measured the signal levels of the towers. They used radio frequencies out of a car that was moving on the highway. Since it was a decade later, there was a slight difference in Verizon's technology. They still used what's called CDMA. Stay with me because this is going to make sense in a minute. But now LTE existed. So the towers, while they didn't change in height, they still changed in coverage. I mean, of course they did. Obviously, the coverage area expands over the years. But as the forensic team was driving down the highway, they found at the base of Highway 74, Tower 745 was blocked by the environment in 2 places. In those places, the radio was getting a signal from Tower 523. All this just means that the time that Christian's phone had jumped to Tower 523 could have been while he and Robert drove toward Pinyon Pines. It's getting eerie.
In 2016, Bodmer tracked down the man who had made the anonymous tip in 2011. This guy's name was Jeremy Todd Witt. In 2006, he was the security supervisor at the water park where Christian and Robert worked. And he served in the Marine Corps.
Which was interesting because remember, Robert said that Becky invited a Marine on their hike? Right. Maybe it had something to do with Jeremy, or maybe Robert was just making something up and he used Jeremy as his inspiration.
Well, Jeremy sat down with Bodmer and another investigator in May 2016. He said in 2007, a year after the murders and after Robert had been fired, he and Christian were still working with the water park, along with Christian's roommate.
I don't even think we've talked about Christian's roommate that much yet, but...
Right. At that time, Jeremy said he noticed Christian wasn't paying attention during his lifeguarding shift, so he asked why Christian was spacing out.
Yeah, and we already heard this in the tip. Remember, he was looking up at the mountains and then said something about burning something?
Right. Jeremy said that Christian shook his head and gazed out at the mountains where Pinyon Pines is located. And Jeremy said, You keep staring in that direction. Something's wrong. That's when Christian's shoulders tensed up, and he admitted to torching a place up in the mountains. Jeremy asked Christian to clarify, and according to Jeremy, Christian shook his head and said, "Something went wrong, and we torched the effing place." He was visibly tense, like something was amiss, and he acted disturbed and stressed for days. Jeremy was confused, especially because he hadn't heard about any of these murders.
And I'm confused why Christian would be so disturbed now in 2007, before the search warrant on his house was even executed and so long after the murders happened.
Well, in October, a month later, Christian's roommate told Jeremy the police raided their apartment, looking for evidence of a crime that the police thought Robert had committed. Christian's roommate explained that Robert's girlfriend, not ex-girlfriend, had been murdered. Jeremy didn't know those people well and wasn't confident about the details. Then in late October of 2007, Jeremy said he ran into Christian at a party. They discussed Jeremy's time in the Marines since Christian planned to join the military and serve time in Afghanistan. They talked about firing weapons and even killing people. Jeremy told Bodmer, quote, "I informed Christian that you don't have to necessarily be a killer just to have served," end quote. And his response was, "Or you could have killed and not served."
What? Okay, that's weird. So Christian was like, "Or you could have killed and not served."
Right.
So he's implying that he's saying, like, murderers join the military. I don't know. It was just odd. But either way, murder was clearly on Christian's mind.
Right. And Jeremy said that months later, in April 2008, he resigned from Not Soak City because he had a disagreement with another manager. He didn't place the anonymous tip until 2011 because he didn't know the name of Robert's girlfriend. He apparently never heard of the triple murder case until he saw it on TV. It was actually Jeremy's mom who convinced him to go to the police. Jeremy didn't say why he wanted to remain anonymous at the time and did not mention the reward money, though it's likely that Jeremy saw the Meet Becky billboard and knew about the $50,000.
Exactly. And Bodmer knew that Jeremy's testimony was enough circumstantial evidence to arrest Robert and Christian yet again. And they were taken back into custody in June of 2015 on 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstance allegations of taking multiple lives. The DNA and fingerprint results came back as the prosecution was building their case. The laboratory found a major and minor contributor on that business card one more time and determined the major contributor this time was Christian. But this time it was 1 in 28 trillion chance that it was a Caucasian male with Christian's DNA as a qualified contributor. And I'm not sure how they got this number, but the results were clear. Christian touched the business card at some point, and this business card was found at the crime scene. Now, I am not good at statistics. I hated that class when I was getting my psychology degree. But if what they're saying points to Christian, then I'm not going to argue.
Well, aside from the DNA, there was something else. In January of 2018, Alma Flores, a fingerprint analyst from the California Department of Justice, looked at the photographs of the business card fingerprints. She never saw the physical prints, just enhanced photographs to make the prints more visible. She said both prints, not just one print this time, were similar enough to Christian's prints that they conclusively matched. He touched the card.
Wow. Okay, so fingerprints make much more sense to me, and that's crazy, but isn't that still circumstantial? And I guess I'll just argue with myself and say that circumstantial evidence is just as good in most cases.
Well, they were still gathering evidence, and in April of 2018, detectives Bodmer and Harvey did a drive test to see how long it would take for Robert and Christian to drive to Vicky's house to Christian's dad's house. They left at 9:40 p.m. from Pinyon Pines in 2 different cars, raced down Highway 74, and took 2 routes to Christian's dad's. Both routes took 38 minutes.
Okay, well, I mapped it. Of course I did. And Google Maps said that it would take 45 to 50 minutes. So they must have been going pretty fast, which made me wonder, why would someone speed with unregistered guns in their car after leaving a crime scene if everything we know is true?
It seems the red truck zooming down the street, even if it had nothing to do with the murders, gave the impression that the murders must have raced away from the scene, influencing both the drive test and the investigation.
Got it. Okay, so they were just like, okay, red card speeding. We're just going to assume murderer speeding. But if you look at the timeline presented by arson and burn analysts, Becky was burned about 20 to 30 minutes before the firefighters arrived to extinguish the flames. If they got there at 10:12, Becky would have been set on fire between 9:42 and 9:52. If Tim called the fire in at 9:55, that leaves a window of time for the perpetrators to leave around 9:45. If the perpetrators drove home in 38 minutes speeding, they would have needed to leave at exactly 9:45 in order for Robert's phone to ping off Tower 88 at 10:23 p.m. It's not impossible, but I want you to understand why so much doubt remained in this case. A lot of people argued it just could not be done. From the timeline alone, it's more likely Robert and Christian never even went to Becky's, but the DNA and the fingerprint evidence say otherwise.
Jeremy Witt is the only reason the two men were arrested the second time. And funny, Jeremy Witt refused to testify at the trial. It turns out he had an unresolved criminal misdemeanor. He didn't want to testify in the case because he may incriminate himself.
And of course, Robert and Christian's defense attorneys found this very interesting. So I wanted to tell you the story, which is pretty wild. I'll be brief. When the attorneys were investigating Jeremy, they discovered he was much of a delight, and I'm kidding. His old coworkers at Knox-Soak City said that he was aggressive with customers. He even flashed a gun at someone. He came to work with a hatchet in his truck, and he threatened to kill their general manager, which is why he didn't resign. He was actually fired in March of 2016. Now, Jeremy's neighbors saw him loading guns into his truck, and he was arrested for having a handgun in the seat of his car. And after that, he pulled his gun on his neighbor from 30 feet away, but the trial was riding on this man's testimony.
Wow.
So another one of Jeremy's neighbors named James Carter had a conversation with Jeremy in 2018. And Jeremy told James that he was responsible for breaking open the case. He was like bragging that it's because of his tip. And he said there was this reward. Now, he didn't say that he wanted the reward, but he did say he was scared of someone coming after him if he testified. Maybe because of the money or because he had snitched. But there were so many names in this case. I was trying to make sure everyone was keeping up. Well, James, who's Jeremy's neighbor, he actually worked with Robert and Christian's friend Sam. Do you remember Sam? He was the one that was supposed to go paint gun shooting with them that night. Well, apparently, while working with Sam, James mentioned that he knew Jeremy, the guy who solved the case. And Sam said Jeremy was a piece of trash and only called in that tip to get the cash reward. So there was just all this like back and forth on whether he really just called in for the reward and he was making everything up or whether he wasn't. So different people were coming forward, but the people that were coming forward were kind of like connected to Robert and Christian. So there was like no one that was really credible. That was the problem. So in the end, Jeremy pretended he was someone else because he wanted to like provide evidence to support his own claim. And they figured it all out. And this resulted in a criminal misdemeanor. Because of that, he couldn't testify in the case because then he would be, incriminating himself because he's had to tell this part of the case. Anyway, I hope that makes sense, but that was what was happening. So there was just way too much going on. And I don't know what to believe at this point.
Yeah, it's pretty confusing. But in April of 2018, 12 years after Jon, Vicky, and Becky had been murdered, the trial against Robert and Christian was held in Robert Presley Hall of Justice. The prosecution was Brandon Smith and John Akey against Robert's attorney, Richard Blumenfeld, and Christian's attorney, Jeff Moore. The prosecution pulled out all the stops, the DNA evidence, the fingerprints, the guns, the van's shoes, the phone record. The motive was said to be jealousy. Robert was mad that Becky wanted to smooth things over and he didn't have control over her anymore. And Christian went along with whatever Robert did. Their alibis were each other. And even though the investigation was poor, the prosecution argued it was obvious from the start that they were responsible.
Now, there was a woman named Jessica Woodbridge. She was a Bank of America custodian, and she testified that Robert's checking account had no charges for September 17th. So that meant that Robert didn't go to that gas station to purchase the chapstick. But of course, the defense argued, well, wait a minute. He could have used cash or he could have used a credit card.
The defense poked hundreds of holes in the prosecution's theory. Allegedly, Robert and Christian's alibi could have been confirmed if the video game equipment was looked at to see what times they had actually played that evening, or if the gas station surveillance footage was accessed earlier, and if the middle school was searched thoroughly for evidence of paintball.
But now all of this was impossible because it's been 12 years. And Daniela's testimony of the Denny's argument couldn't be backed up. Christian's phone pinging on the opposite side of the valley couldn't be explained because you got one phone pinging over here and one over here. And the van's shoes didn't even match the ones at the crime scene. Instead of Robert and Christian being guilty, the defense suggested the jury needs to take a look at good old Javier. His dad worked with the sheriff's department. And remember, there was a sheriff's department pen at the crime scene. But Javier's DNA was never tested against the pen or the wheelbarrow. And that makes me wonder why. Robert's ex, Sarah, said on the stand that her now ex-husband was the best person she ever met. She said she would stand up for him no matter what, even if they were no longer together. But when they cross-examined her, it was the nail in the coffin.
The prosecution asked Sarah if she had ever talked to Robert about hiding weapons. Sarah said she couldn't remember ever having a conversation about that, so the prosecution presented a recording.
And this, I have to say, was very interesting. It was a phone call between Robert and Sarah back in June of 2014 after Robert went to jail. He and Sarah decided to sell their home, and they wanted to give some of Robert's possessions to his extended family. He sent his guns to his grandmother and his aunt, and Robert told Sarah on the phone, quote, "I would just have the HK and I would have everything else in the spot where I put them. The rest of them should be placed in the location where I had them sent," end quote. So the key things here are HK, because that refers to an H&K, one of the guns that matched up with a bullet that killed Vicky. And if Robert had an H&K and he referred to the rest of his guns being sent to where the H&K was, this meant that the H&K must have already been hidden from the start. And in this conversation, they also discussed an unregistered .40 caliber Glock. So Robert possessed yet another weapon, which was considered one of the murder weapons. And the law didn't know about it. Plus, it seemed obvious to the investigators that Robert was hiding guns based on the vague nature of the part where he goes, "spot where I put them." But of course, Sarah insisted that the conversation never even struck her as important, which is why she didn't even remember it. And she said that Robert wasn't trying to hide the guns from the police. He just wanted all of his guns in one place. And he was using vague language because she already knew what he was talking about. But I'm sorry, this is more incriminating evidence. Not to mention, she admitted prior to all this under cross-examination that night, the night of the murders, we remember this, she couldn't get a hold of Robert all night, which she found to be unusual. She testified that after being unable to reach him for hours, they finally spoke around 8:30 p.m. However, the prosecutors showed the phone records, and this call actually happened at 10:43 p.m., long after the murder had already occurred and 911 was dispatched. Sarah often claimed that she couldn't remember so many things and she would believe her ex-husband and former friends were innocent, but that's just convenient. After 6 weeks of testimony from approximately 45 witnesses, the jury made up of 10 men and 2 women deliberated for 10 days. The verdict, well, it was a hard decision, but they had to come to a conclusion. 29-year-old Christian was found guilty of first-degree murder of Vicky Friedley and John Hayward, and 30-year-old Robert was found guilty of first-degree murder of Vicky and John and second-degree murder of Becky.
On Friday, August 10th, 2018, they were sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, Mike Hestrin apologized to the Friedleys and the Hayward families for the pain they had gone through. They didn't deserve for the investigation to be dragged out that long.
But Ron said he will never get closure, but he knows in his heart that Robert and Christian are 100% guilty. Daniela hoped that they would be in jail for life, and Tanya said she misses her mom and her sister so much. John's daughter, Kitty, just feels so sad. She thought that the sentencing would bring her satisfaction, but it reminded her that her father was taken much too soon. Kitty doesn't want to speak the names of the perpetrators any longer. She said that now that we know who's responsible, they don't deserve to be remembered. And I agree, but this is a wild case.
And the perpetrators' families are doing whatever they can to make sure their sons are remembered. In fact, Robert's old co-worker, Beatrice Mora, is so convinced of his innocence that she chose to marry him after he was sentenced.
Wow.
Beatrice thinks that the Friedleys and the Hayward families must hate the Pape and Smith families for their work to overturn the sentencing. They are in major denial about the conviction and have crafted a website to convince the world that they weren't responsible.
I mean, it is one of those cases that has a lot of reasonable doubt, in my opinion, but I wasn't on the jury, and I believe that they know best because they have access to all the evidence, so I side with their determination. But Christian and Robert have appealed their sentence on many counts, and Christian's words in his sentencing continue to haunt me. He said he was innocent and that he felt no remorse. And that last part seems odd to me. But just thinking about the fact that Becky was supposed to meet with Christian and Robert that night, and that Robert had a girlfriend, so why would he agree to that if there wasn't a sinister scheme? And she supposedly cheated on him. Plus, that card from the church that they were supposed to go to that night is found at the crime scene with Christian's fingerprints and DNA on it. The instant message between Robert and Sarah, where Robert just volunteers to burn her ex's house down, in addition to the jail conversations, it does say a lot. But doesn't it seem a bit over the top to kill 3 people because of a breakup?
In all the cases that we've done and I've heard you do, nothing seems out of the ordinary.
That's true. That is very true. In the end, this is a story that's said to boil down to jealousy. It appears that Robert was still bent out of shape over him and Becky and continued to harass her. According to those close to Becky, she tried to make it stop. The prosecution believed that they did go on the hike, or under the guise of doing so, Robert and Christian met up with Becky. And as Jeremy said, Christian told him that something went wrong and they torched the effing place. I'm not going to speculate on the sequence of events because, I mean, it could be anything. But Vicky, Jon, and Becky were all killed and they were set on fire. And the prosecution believed it was a personal attack against Becky's family and her memory. So did they go there with the intention to maybe just scare her or to kill her? We will never know. But this case is going to stick with me. And I have so many thoughts, but I want to get all of your thoughts. One last thing that I do find sad is that Robert and Christian's families are so hell-bent on sticking up for them that they paint Robert and Christian as the victims in this crime. Not once on that website, which is run by these families, do they feature photos or bios or anything positive about the 3 people who lost their lives, Jon, Vicky, and Becky. And I do understand their anger and their frustration, but still, they could at the very least honor them in some way. So my heart does go out to everyone involved, and I hope that this does come to an end so that everyone can rest. And I hope, despite all the twists and turns of this case, that Jon, Vicky, and Becky are the names and the faces that you will remember.
Thank you all for watching this week's case, and we hope we see you on the next one.
Bye.